Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Politicians of both parties have mastered the use of dog whistle racism, coded and veiled racial appeals to agitate white voters to turn Americans against each other, while generating support for policies that favor society's wealthiest and most powerful. Dog whistle politics is about appeal to racial fears without overtly mentioning race at all. It's about the strategic and cynical manipulation of racism, a purposeful reinvention used by the Republican Party to become the white man's party. The dog whistle of racism has helped destabilize and hasten the decline of the middle class, white and non-white alike, seducing them to vote against their own economic interests, convincing them that government and not concentrated wealth is the greatest threat to their lives. Ian Haney Lopez is the author of this now classic book, Dog Whistle Politics, which broke the code on the racist politics of the last 50 years. He's the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at the University of California in Berkeley. He's a pioneering writer in the genre of critical race theory. He's worked with the AFL-CIO as a co-chair on their advisory committee on racial and economic justice and co-founded the Race Class Narrative Project. His latest book, Merged Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, draws on these experiences. Our other guest today is the writer, preacher, and moral activist Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. He's the author of more than a dozen books, including with Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of the New Justice Movement. His newest book is Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. Reverend Barber has called Jonathan a scribe for the moral movement in America today, challenging a false narrative, showing us how faith can revive the heart and soul of this democracy. Ian ends his book with an homage to his mentor, Professor Derek Bell, whose words are seen as the best response to dog whistle racism. And this is to quote Professor Bell. Somehow, as the legacy of our spirituals makes clear, our enslaved ancestors managed to retain their humanity as well as their faith that evil and suffering were not the extent of the destiny or of the destiny of those who follow them. We owe our existence to their perseverance and their faith. We must do no less than they did, fashion a philosophy that both matches the unique dangers we face and enables us to recognize in those dangers opportunities for committed living and humane service. Thank you. Thank you both. Welcome to the Radical Imagination. Ian and Jonathan, it's great to have you here for this dialogue. And special thanks to you, Jonathan. I've admired Ian's work enormously over the years, but you're the one that really said, let's have a dialogue, and we've got one. And Ian just responded in, I think, a quarter of a second after I emailed him, and he said, I can't wait. So here we are. This is fabulous. And thank you both for being here.
Oh, delighted to be here.
Absolutely. Well, let me get this started by asking you, both this, but at first, you had a chance in the late 80s and early 90s to study at Harvard with Professor Derek Bell, one of our greatest thinkers on race and racism. Now, you disagreed with one of his central claims in the course, that you're smiling already, okay, that there had been little genuine progress in American race relations. You even ended up stopping to take his course in mid-semester. Yet that estrangement ended up in a deeper understanding of his work and influenced dog whistle politics profoundly. So tell our audience how that came about, helped lead to the book. And Jonathan, how has Ian's book influenced your own thinking in your own work and book, Revolution of Values?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that Professor Derek Bell, a brilliant scholar, truly a brilliant scholar, a pioneer, also an incredible human being, really wrestling with racism and spirituality and what the future was likely to hold for people of color in the United States. And I think as a student of his, I found his teachings enormously challenging because of his deep pessimism. And I think that on a personal level, he was challenging me to come to understand that racism wasn't about me and couldn't be measured in terms of my own life experiences. And I think this is a lesson that so many of us have to learn, that racism is this profound dynamic that has greatly skewed, I put it in the past tense, but really in the present tense, greatly skews, greatly distorts, greatly twists, disforms our society. And many of us in some ways are relatively privileged. Myself, half white, half Latino, grew up in Hawaii, middle-class family, had the good fortune to study with Derek Bell at Harvard Law School. So when I was first thinking about race and Bell was so pessimistic, I was thinking about it through the lens of my own experience rather than really saying, well, no, race is something that's happening, that's structuring our whole society, and the worst, the most intense, the most horrific, the most violent expressions of racism are not what I encounter, right? So that was the big challenge. Now, it was a challenge that took me 10 or 15 years to really think through and to say, this isn't about me. I have something to say, I can learn about it. But this is about other people's experiences. So I want to identify that, but then I want to also raise up another insight that Professor Bell offered that I've wrestled with, for now close to 25 years. And it was his idea of interest convergence. And I think it's going to be an important idea to this conversation that we're going to have. Because one of Bell's insights was, hey, racism and in particular, more than just racism, racial emancipation depends upon people seeing it as being in their interests. And that this is true not only for people of color, but for whites. And Bell said, and this was, I think, the source of his deep pessimism, racial advancement, the advancement of society towards a racially egalitarian society, that doesn't happen except when it's in the interests of significant sectors of powerful segments of the white community, right? And this is his big, but this is an idea that I've been wrestling with too. And I'll just say this, just as something that we'll get to. I now think in a way that Professor Bell did not, that racial justice for people of color is deeply in the interest of the white community, and that in 2020, 2021, we might possibly be able to convince the majority of whites to see that racial justice for communities of color is actually one of the most important interests they could be pursuing for their own white families right now.
Yes, indeed. And that's why I'm so grateful for the work that you've been doing, because it so aligns with my own experience and with our experience in the Poor People's Campaign of organizing poor white folks and poor black folks and poor brown folks in communities, and especially, recently in communities like West Virginia, which are predominantly white, and where this so-called populism of the corporate elites is run amok and has convinced so many people that their interests are tied up with defending and protecting corporate interests. When the the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, refuses to get on board with raising the minimum wage, refuses to protect voting rights. We've talked about the assault on voting rights in the country this year as a new Jim Crow or an anti-Black measure, which it certainly is. It is racist in its intent in many instances, but the same model legislation that got pushed through Georgia and Arizona was also pushed through in West Virginia, a state that's 92% white, and it was pushed through because the folks who are in power there want to hold on to power that they've convinced many white people is somehow serving their quote unquote white interests, when as a matter of fact, it's serving corporate interests. And so what you're talking about in terms of helping all of us realize that the injustice of these structures hurts most of us is incredibly important for the organizing that we need to do these days to try to defend against the assaults on democracy.
Yeah, and so here, let me come back to what Bell was saying and what I'm taking away from Bell, or what I'm, have learned from him, but also the change I'm making. And I want to phrase it in terms of a paradigm of racism. Mm-hmm. What do we think racism is? And so many of us, and I was certainly raised this way and taught this way and thought this way as a scholar, so many of us think racism is fundamentally a hierarchy of white over non-white. And then we go from there. And I think that, especially when we're thinking about race through our personal experience, that sort of model tends to make sense because we're in conflict with racist folks or racist institutions or elite white spaces. And so it really is very easy to think of racism as white over non-white. And in many ways it is. It is that. But I want to offer a different paradigm that looks behind it and that says racism in the United States, racism as it arose through colonialism, racism as it is practiced at its most fundamental sense today, is class war that succeeds when it promotes white over non-white hierarchy. Yeah. The white over non-white hierarchy, it's there. It's hugely important. But driving it, funding it, promoting it, and profiting from it is class war. And I think this is a dynamic that we can see very clearly in the modern history of the United States. What has happened to this country since the civil rights era? But I actually think it's this deeper truth about what racism has always been. Racism and capitalism arise together in the context of colonialism. And colonialism develops an idea of racism that facilitates the brutality of capitalism, right? So these things they've always been bound together. Yeah. We've dropped that sense for the most part. We've dropped that sense, but we need to recover it. To really begin to see racism is class war. It does not affect us all in the same ways because it succeeds through white over non-white hierarchy by making it real, by enforcing it, by constantly reinventing it, by arming it. Right? So people of color are suffering much worse in this class war waged through racism. But ultimately is class war. And if we can shift to that paradigm, then we can say, oh, we're not all suffering the same, but we are all losing when racism wins, when we organize our lives around racism. And I think this is the number one message, let's say, for West Virginia. Yeah. Y'all are organizing your lives. You're being encouraged to organize your lives around a white over non-white hierarchy, when the hierarchy that is actually immiserating you is the hierarchy of the wealthy few over all the rest of us.
Is this also, are you referring to this as strategic racism as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, the term strategic racism, let me compare it to another term, structural racism. Okay, so I think structural racism is out there. It's pervasive. Structural racism is a way for us to understand how racism practice for centuries has become embedded in the institutions and the patterns of our society, enormous. But think about something like mass incarceration. We often talk about mass incarceration as structural racism, and partly it is, but that's not the root cause of mass incarceration. The root cause of mass incarceration is something much more dangerous, much more active, much more intentional. It's strategic racism. In the early 1970s, we had 200,000 people behind prison and bars. Now that number is closer to 1.5 million, or depending on how you count it, even 2 million people.
No.
That's not inertia. That's not, oh, we had these structures that were put in place in the 1900s. We had something that, you know, was put in place in the 1800s, and it just continued because we never dismantled it. Something active happened. What happened? You had politicians like Richard Nixon and then Ronald Reagan and then even Bill Clinton begin to campaign through lies about people of color as dangerous, as criminal. And then if those were those campaign statements, they then translated that into action, funding police, defunding social services, putting tremendous resources towards prisons, creating new laws, creating system penalties and 3 strikes laws. You had people, politicians, campaign on stories of racial threat as a strategy. And then they carried through with a theater of racial threat that demanded prison building and mass incarceration. It's strategic racism, much more than structures, much more than inertia, that has built up the massive carceral system that we're living under now, right? And I want people to start thinking about strategy as racism as strategy, because I think that it gets us towards thinking some people are doing this right now. Who? Which are the powerful people who are doing this? And why are they doing it? Are they doing it because somehow they're, closet Klan members and that they're driven by the heated emotions of hate? Or is this the cold emotion of profit, where they're thinking to themselves, take Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, I think, probably said to himself, I like black people. I like Vernon Jordan. But the way you win in politics in America is by scaring white voters about black people as being dangerous. And you use code, you use theater, you never say it out loud, but that code, that theater, that's how you win. And if that's how you win, I'm willing to do what I need to do to win.
So
there he is. That's strategy. That's cold. And frankly,
and it gets us into the morality of this, right? The spiritual aspect, right, Jonathan?
Oh, for sure. I mean, you're counting the cost, you're making a calculation, and you're investing in what you think serves your interest. I think that's certainly what's going on. And I think the insight of the Black-led freedom movement has been that this has been a pattern, right? What does Dr. King say, to the crowd when they get to the end of the Selma to Montgomery March? He says, in the slavery days, the plantation owners took the world and, gave the enslaved folks Jesus. And after the Reconstruction was overthrown, they took the world back and they gave the white man Jim Crow. And he said, when the white man didn't have anything to eat or to feed his children, at least he could give them Jim Crow. I mean, there is this way in which the kinds of things that Ian is describing today in terms of dog whistle, they were more explicit in the past, but people were given ways of understanding themselves within a system that powerful people wanted to defend, that made them at least feel good about who they could be in that system. And yet that system was perpetuating an injustice that hurt Black and white people in the South, that today I think hurts a majority of people in the United States. What we've found with the Poor People's Campaign is that there are 140 million people in the country who are poor or low income. It's nearly half of the country. This is in the richest nation in the history of the world. And it's about what we've decided to invest in, right? We're having a conversation right now on Capitol Hill about, whether we can make investment in physical infrastructure or in the social infrastructure that's needed. And, we're talking about trillions of dollars. But we're also very aware of the fact that we just, ended a 20-year war, which between Afghanistan and Iraq, we invested $6 trillion without much argument about it into that, because, of course, the people who were making the decisions knew that they and their friends could make money off of that. And I think these calculations are made. They're made all the time. I think Ian's absolutely right. They're made by Republicans and Democrats. And what we need is a moral movement that brings people together and says, we do have some traditions that tell us what's worth investing in. And it is up to us as people to create the moral force that says that the people who are in charge are going to have to listen to that, or are going to have to deal with an uprising of people who say we're not willing to go along with these sorts of compromises.
Just to be clear, are we talking about a phenomenon here that's conscious, subconscious, unconscious combination? Can we clear that up?
I think you're talking, it's working differently for different people, but I want to be clear. There's a subset of people for whom this is entirely conscious, entirely strategic, thought out, considered, balanced, tested, right? And so think about somebody like Richard Nixon, for example. So this sort of dog whistle politics of like, well, let's try and win votes by appealing to white resentment of Black equality. This gets its start in the early 1960s, this coded version, because you're absolutely right. The historic version, race has always been, white supremacy has always been central to the politics of the United States. It was central to, it developed with colonialism, but by 1776, right, the pattern of thinking through what our country should look like through the lens of white supremacy is well established. What changes is in the 40s and the 50s, and certainly into the 1960s, because in part of the success of the civil rights movement, you can no longer use the express language of white supremacy. You can no longer stand up and hope to succeed on a national stage, and even really in southern states, by saying, I believe in the superiority of the white man and in the inferiority of the fill in the N word, right? On a national stage, you can't say that anymore. So starting in the 1960s, you get this alternative language, these dog whistles, these coded phrases that on their surface don't mention race, but that underneath communicate a message of continued white dominance. And so in the early 1960s, there is Barry Goldwater, Republican, part of this faction that wanted to lead a class war against the New Deal. He starts talking about states' rights. On the surface, no reference to race. But of course, everybody understood states' rights meant the right of Southern states to continue to use law and custom to segregate, oppress, and humiliate African Americans. Okay, but this is a story about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon in 1962 gives an interview with Ebony magazine, and he says, Republican Party can't possibly follow Barry Goldwater. Good God, that what he's doing is racist. And were we to try and sacrifice the Negro vote, he says, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, would for the first time become an all-white party. So Nixon sees clearly what Barry Goldwater is doing. Fast forward to the fall of 1968, Richard Nixon is running for election himself. It's a tight race. He realizes he needs the South, and he realizes that Goldwater's language of appealing to whites is the route to electoral success in the South. It's the route to peeling away white Democrats and getting them to vote for a Republican. And so Richard Nixon starts doing this himself. Is this conscious? 100%. This is not about unconscious or patterns or something that was assimilated or internalized. Richard Nixon knew that what he was doing was using coded language to appeal to racially fearful whites in the South, right? And so, and we see this over and over again. We see this in the comments by Lee Atwater, for example, who ran Ronald Reagan's campaign, George H.W. Bush's campaigns, who's the architect of the infamous Willie Horton ad. He became the chair of the Republican National Committee. He said, you start out saying N-word, N-word, N-word. Pretty soon you can't say that anymore. So you start talking about states' rights. And that's the strategy. He was incredibly clear about it. Now, for the voters, and this is a very important distinction, most people do not hear this language and recognize it consciously as out and out racism. And in fact, not only are politicians trying to take advantage of this, but so are the white supremacists, the Klan members, the Nazis, even the language of the alt-right. These are folks that are self-consciously racist, that are consciously committed to white supremacy. But they want to find a way to translate that language and to make it palatable and to bring people along. And so they use this coded language. And most people, when I say most people, I mean most Republicans. I also mean the majority of Democrats. I mean the majority of union households. I mean the majority of Latinos. And I mean the majority of African Americans.
And so
majority do not hear this language as out and out racist.
And liberals, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
So I want to make clear. So liberals and progressives acquiesce. They lose their moral backbone, their moral center.
That is one of the huge challenges here. Dog whistle politics relies on racist stereotypes. Racist stereotypes suffuse our society. Many liberals subscribe to racist stereotypes at a subconscious level. And then at a conscious level, they also believe in racial egalitarianism. Just about every single one of us have split minds on race. We consciously think racism's wrong. We do not believe in white supremacy. We reject the idea of white dominance. We believe in racial egalitarianism. And yet, we've internalized racist stereotypes. And what are some of those stereotypes? Innocence among whites, criminality among people of color, reasonableness and thoughtfulness among whites, passion, emotion, lasciviousness among people of color, right? And it's like going on and on and on. We've internalized those. And now what the right has done purposefully, and the right, I mean the political right, but I also mean the racial right, the white nationalists, is they've developed a language that drops open references to biology and instead uses references to culture, where the cultural references track the stereotypes. Illegal aliens, terrorists, gangbangers, those are all culture and behavior. But those are just the old racist stereotypes now, disembodied, free from direct references to biology, but they're still operating the same way. And that's the power of dog whistling, that there's this rhetoric out there that is speaking to racist stereotypes that we've deeply internalized. What is the language? What is the moral call that we're using that speaks to the values that we've also adopted? The racial egalitarianism, the sense of community, the belief that out of many people, we make one for democracy to succeed, right? That's the challenge, I think, for progressives.
That's absolutely right. The only thing I would add is that to add to the challenge is that in this process that you're describing of coming up with, cultural markers to have dog whistles rather than explicitly racist, it was another very intentional thing that happened was that those same people who were trying to hold on to power by playing to their white base decided to use the language of their religion. And they knew that white people, particularly white people in the South and the suburbs, were overwhelmingly Christian. And so they started talking about biblical values and traditional values and equating those with cultural markers of whiteness that you're talking about. And so the language in the public square for the past 40 years about morality has been shaped by this overwhelming way in which people on the political right have talked about values in coded racist ways, and people on the political left have, by and large, steered clear of claims about morality. And so, in many people's minds, traditional values or moral values are strictly those stereotypes that have been pushed by the so-called religious right.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more.
The work that I did in Revolution of Values, I tried to tell that story, and especially to appeal to Christians to realize that this was a way to exploit our tradition, a tradition that I share, in order to align us with a political party. I think it's been disastrous for the democracy. I think it's also been disastrous for Christianity, and so that's why I wrote that book.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think there's a class story, a race story, and a gender story that all combine in evangelical Christianity, and it's kind of a history. 30s and 40s and 50s, you see big money, dark money investing heavily in evangelical churches to try and promote a sort of a sense that Christianity is aligned with libertarianism, that it is in opposition to New Deal activist government in which we try and take care of each other. So that's the class dynamic that's always been there. Then you get the race dynamic. Once public schools are ordered integrated in the South and whites flee public school systems, very often they ended up in Christian academies. They were called segregation academies, but to try and diffuse the racial component, they became known as Christian academies. And then people began to use the language of defending Christian academies and then defending Christianity, when what they meant was defending racial segregation. And then in the 1970s and into the 1980s, you had a shift where, again, these same sort of corporate elites recognize that they can engage in culture war politics around the so-called traditional family. And so gender understood as patriarchy, the role of women in the workplace, availability of abortion, homosexuality, now transgender identity, all of that too was weaponized in terms of a reactionary evangelical church that has taken the language of spirituality and assigned it a sort of a set of, I think, really cruel understandings about the relationship between people in community with others, all funded by dark money, which actually profits when people fear and hate and look down upon their neighbors in the name of spirituality.
Yes, indeed. What I tell Christians all the time, if you really believe that our whole tradition exists to prop up the rich and the powerful in this society, then why in the world would they have ever killed Jesus? They would have given that brother a contract so big, he would have lived into his 90s. He would have had all the support he could get from the world if he had been doing that. No, Christians believe that Jesus was executed because he challenged that system. So these folk who go around saying that, Jesus wants to prop up the male dominant tradition, so-called traditional values, corporate interest, are denying the truth of our story, and they're denying the resurrection, because you can't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead if you think that he went along with a system that would have never killed him.
I think another way, the kind of way I think about it is the idea that Jesus was committed to a sort of a radical individualism and not to a sense of community and neighborliness and taking care of each other, right? Because that's really what the reactionary right is promoting. Yeah. And you can see it if we go back to the class sort of lens. The only real threat to money power is people coming together, is people power. That's the only real threat. And money power knows that. It's always known that. And so what does it do? It tries to divide people, but it also tries to convince people you're on your own. And don't look to your neighbors for support. In fact, look at your neighbors with fear.
Mm-hmm.
Close your door to your neighbor. Punch down at your neighbor. Look down at your neighbor. Buy a gun to protect yourself from your neighbor, right? There's this incredible sort of social isolationist, individualist, libertarianism. All of that helps when you're really rich, because then you're rich and you have all the power you need. And the last thing you want is organized people saying, you've got too much power. This is not a healthy society. On the other hand, I always understood the message from Jesus to be saying, take care of your neighbor. We're in relationship with each other. Build relationship with each other. Build community in a way that's meaningful and that involves a sense of connection with each other. And I think that's the message that has, in my mind, that has been most grossly distorted, right? Or maybe I try it a different way. The communities that evangelical churches are building are walled communities. Communities in which they say just us, but no one on the other side of this wall, no one on the other side of this boundary. And I don't think that was the message. I think the message was tear down the walls. To create community even with the stranger, so that person is stranger no longer, but now understood as neighbor or even as kin.
Let me ask both of you, do you think this sort of thinking is beginning to break down through the Biden administration? How are we doing with him? And what sort of organizing is going to be needed to build a coalition for transformative change in the immediate political future, 2022 and 2024? How are we doing? How is Biden doing, administration?
Well, we have a Biden administration because an overwhelming organizing effort of people who came out and voted for change. And I think the recalcitrance that we've seen, particularly in the Senate, even with a willingness to push forward the agenda that he ran on, is what we're up against. And that's where I think people have to be organizing now. I mean, the organizing that the Poor People's Campaign has been doing in West Virginia and in Arizona is to challenge Democrats. But it's Democrats who are, siding with their corporate donors over the people's agenda, and who are blocking the agenda that Biden wants to push forward, that he's committed to push forward. And so I think where we are is with a need for real people power to push and to push hard and to say, this was never just about getting Donald Trump out of there. It's about really pushing forward an agenda that isn't real until it becomes law and until it has investment behind it, until we begin to shift the way we organize ourselves in the society. So we certainly got a long way to go.
And you're certainly not saying Biden is a new FDR here. He is not taking that progressive stance. Could he do more along those lines?
I think from my point of view, there's so many ways to answer this. And one of the things I want to pick, sort of lift up and amplify is sort of the organizing work being done by the new Poor People's Campaign. I mean, I can't stress enough how much we're in this transitional period. In some ways, I take tremendous hope from it. There's more energy, greater ambition, bigger accomplishments than I've seen in my lifetime in terms of activity and energy and vision and mission among regular folks. And I think we just need to keep leaning into that and providing whatever support. When we think about the Biden administration, on one level, I think the policy proposals are amazing. And no, it's not quite FDR, but it's the closest thing we've seen, at least since Lyndon Johnson and his discussion of a sort of a war on poverty that he proposed but then did not fund. So this is huge. I think for me, yes, the Biden administration could do much more to use its political muscle against recalcitrant politicians like Joe Manchin. But I think the thing that I'd really highlight the most is, what is the story that the Biden administration is telling America? Because that's where I think we could really use some help, and the Biden administration could really step forward and I think could learn a lot from the Poor People's Campaign. The Biden administration, I think, is telling a story that talks a lot about policy, a little bit about class, and a little bit about race. And it ought to just flip that on its head. And it ought to be talking about class and race all the time. And, the Biden administration ought to be saying, we are, as a country, a democracy that succeeds or fails depending upon whether we see each other as neighbors or as enemies. And we're being told all the time by Republicans, by Fox News personalities, by hate media, by some churches, to see each other as enemies. We need to reject that lie and embrace the American ideal of creating a sense of linked fate among all of us. And that's not just a moral matter, that's a pragmatic matter. That's the only way we can take care of each other, we can take care of our own families. And it's not just a pragmatic matter, it's actually something that we must proactively pursue, right? Like that's where I think the Biden administration has fallen short, telling the basic story of who we are to each other, and who threatens us. And there, I think, is one of the biggest distinctions between Biden and FDR. FDR in the New Deal was very clear. We're all in this together, but we're being threatened by these malefactors of great wealth. There are people out there who profit from a society that is organized to help the very rich and to impoverish and disempower the vast majority. Those are our enemy. They threaten us. They continually mobilize. They continually strategize. We need to fight if we're going to make progress and actually take care of our own families. That's the FDR, I think, more than the policy part of FDR. That's the FDR that Joe Biden needs to pick up. And I think Biden and Kamala Harris, too, they have the stories, the histories that could allow them to express these ideas in a really compelling way.
Yeah.
Who are we? We're regular folks from very diverse backgrounds coming together to take care of each other in the immediate face of a threat from incredibly wealthy, powerful people who operate often behind the scenes to try and make sure society and government and the economy works for the very few and not for most of us. We must, as a moral and pragmatic matter, build power with each other. Right? That's what I'd love to see coming from the Biden-Harris administration.
Yes, indeed, and that's what the Poor People's Campaign has been offering them very, very much. I mean, let us help you. We want to bring, the people from West Virginia, the folks from Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia who are challenging these assaults on democracy. We want to bring them to the White House and let them speak. I mean, a president, can't make a decision for a senator, but a president sure can use the bully pulpit and use the press corps that's there every day to say, this is the story that we're going to tell. There are black and white people in this country, brown people, people of every race and ethnic background who are coming together to say, we've got to save democracy. And, in the midst of this culture war right now that's being waged around, critical race theory and how we teach history, that is really the distraction that is being manufactured in order to push through voter suppression and election subversion measures. That they are already passing state houses. They will continue to push in that direction if the For the People Act doesn't pass Congress. And that, the president, can't make any senator vote a particular way, but sure does have the platform to do that. And I think can in this moment.
How has he responded to you in the Poor People's Campaign, Jonathan?
Well, everything has been very supportive publicly. He's he's showed up at our events. He says he's with us. He wants to be part of the campaign, and yet we just haven't heard anything back on this. I mean, I think there are lots of people advising different ways. There's lots of negotiations about how things move forward at this point. But this is our clear message, because we know that what he wants to do, what he has said he wants to do, is impossible without overcoming all these forces we've been describing for the past hour. And that can only happen through the power of a movement. And that's what we are here trying to do and what we can offer. There is a movement of people who want to push America toward a more perfect union, and in particular to guard against the assaults on democracy that are very real in this moment, and that he has said publicly, he thinks is the greatest assault on democracy since the Civil War.
Let me be clear about what I think are two real challenges that we have to identify so that we can overcome them. For most white folks, it's an incredible lift to get them to see anti-Black racism as the number one threat in their own white lives, right? Like most white folks, if they think about racism, they think it's bad and it's a problem for communities of color, but hey, it's not about me. And what we're trying to say to folks, and this is what we're trying to say to Joe Biden, for example, is, hey, President Biden, anti-Black racism is the single biggest threat to your administration. It is the single biggest threat to your family. You've never thought it was, but it is, because it's the most potent weapon in this cultural war politics that the rich are winning. That's one big lift. Here's the other big lift. To say to folks, to look at the class element of racism is not to deny racism. It's to try and look at it and behind it. And now this is a challenge with a lot of racial justice folks. A lot of racial justice folks say, hey, these attacks on voting rights, these attacks on critical race theory, mass incarceration, those are all about anti-Blackness. Yeah. And the answer is yes, those are 100%. But also, it's about something behind anti-Blackness, the strategy of money, of big money, of dark money. And to get people to realize that we can think about anti-Blackness as class war in a way that isn't taking anything away from the emphasis on anti-Blackness and the role of racism in our society, but is actually deepening our understanding of why it's so virulent, why it's so well-funded, why there's so much state violence against communities of color. Right? And so those are the two big hurdles. And I would say they're hurdles for all of us, but thinking in particular about the Biden administration, we need a story from them that says simultaneously, racism against people of color is the single biggest threat our society faces, including every white family in the society. And also thinking about racism as being funded and promoted as part of a class war that threatens us all doesn't take anything away from, and indeed emphasizes why anti-Blackness is so virulent and so vicious in society today, right? Those are the two big hurdles that they need to get over intellectually. And frankly, a lot of us being activists, need to give them the permission, need to clear the route for them to say that, right? So that those of us who are organizing around the economy or the environment or schools or public health need to say, we want to hear the Biden administration talking about our issue, and in particular about how racism has been weaponized to make it harder for government to act on our issue that does not seem on its face like it's about race, but it is, because it's race that's being used to divide us and to turn us against each other. And then we need the racial justice folks to say, we want to hear talk about systemic racism, but we also want to hear talk about strategic racism. We want to talk about the dangers of anti-Blackness, but we also want our leadership to say what's behind it, who's motivated, who's motivated to promote it, who's profiting from it, right? We need to clear the space and indeed provide examples so that we can have all of us sort of telling a similar story. We're all in this together. We are being purposefully divided. The main weapon of division is culture war politics. The main form of culture war politics is the promotion of white over non-white hierarchy. That's the story of who we are and how we move forward.
And unfortunately, we can't move forward. Time is our enemy at this point. But let me give Jonathan the last, and it is a time for Jesus, the prophetic tradition. We're in the middle of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Days of Atonement. So that has to be added to your message as well. And I think Professor Bell would be very, very proud and would have loved to have heard this dialogue. And perhaps at some level, he is speaking through all of us here, and certainly you. So thank you, and Jonathan, so very, very much. I'm afraid we are really on overtime here, and we need to wade in the water and move on, move forward. Thank you again so very, very much. God bless, and stay strong and well.
Thank you both.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to us this week on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
Standing for freedom, freedom till he comes. 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 Stand up for freedom, 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 stand up for freedom, 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 stand up for freedom, 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 stand up for freedom, peace on earth and stand up for freedom, freedom, stand up for freedom, word I speak will restore peace again, let there be peace on earth, let the moment be now, when every man and woman understands their power, let there be peace. Let there be peace. Let there be Let there be peace on earth and let it extend to every border near and far. Restore peace again. Let there be peace on earth and let this be the day when all humanity will raise their voices to say, let there be peace. Let there be peace. Let there be peace. Let there be to every border near and far, restore peace again. Let there be peace on earth, let this be the day when all humanity will raise their voices and say, let there be peace. Sing with us, let there be let there be peace. I cannot hear you. Let there be bring it down a little bit, sing. Sing with them, come on. Let there be. There's restoration in the name of peace. Let there be. Our families are healed in the name